Welcome to the Healthy You podcast from NorthShore University Health System, where we explore trending topics in healthcare. I'm Carolyn Starks.
And I'm Jon Hillenbrand.
Today we're going to talk about testing. Test. The Omicron variant is now widespread throughout the United States, and with it has come a huge demand for COVID-19 tests. Home tests are appealing because they allow you to avoid going to a testing center, which can sometimes be backed up, and they also produce results within minutes. But questions are swirling about how accurate they are and how and when they are most useful. So today we have with us Paige Larkin.
I'm Dr. Paige Larkin. I'm the Director of Molecular Microbiology, and I have the amazing opportunity to be working with two incredible labs who've been doing pretty much all of the COVID testing for NorthShore University Health System. I work directly with the Clinical Microbiology Lab and the Molecular Diagnostics Lab, which runs up to thousands of samples for COVID per day, and they are the unsung heroes of the pandemic. They're the ones behind the scenes, handling the specimens, answering your questions, and resulting them so that you can keep yourself and your family safe.
Welcome, Paige.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, we're so thankful for having you here, an expert at-home testing and molecular testing in the lab, because there are so many questions out there from the public about why did I get a false negative, when should I test, and so on and so forth. So let's start first talking about which tests are out there. I think there's two main types we're going to talk about, the PCR and the at-home or the home antigen test. Can you describe each one?
Yes. So the PCR test is a molecular-based test. This is what you do when you go to the physician, and they'll swab your nose for you or your throat or get saliva. And this looks at the viral RNA. And how molecular testing works is it looks at a very tiny amount of virus and it's able to amplify it. So it makes more and more and more copies. So it's very, very, very sensitive. It picks up a low amount of virus. And it's been what we call our gold standard. What that means is that everything's compared to that. That is the gold standard, the diagnostics of how we diagnose COVID-19 infection. And while this methodology is fantastic, it takes time. So you have to get the sample from you at the physician's office to the lab to perform it. These assays take a couple hours or more. And when you have thousands of samples coming through your lab per day, you're going to have even more delay. And so PCR tests can take 24 to 72 hours to return a result. And if you're at home with a sick kid, or you're sick yourself, or you're worried about family or friend, 72 hours can seem like a really long time. So now there's these at-home antigen tests. These are newer, and these are things that you can perform at home. What you can do is go to a local pharmacy, get a test, you swab yourself, you follow the instructions, and you can get results in 15 minutes or less.
Wow.
These are also known as the rapid test.
The rapid antigen test. It looks directly at the amount of viral protein, and it does not amplify it. So if you don't have a really high amount, you're not going to pick it up.
There's like a threshold or something.
There's a threshold, exactly. So with molecular, you can take a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of virus and amplify it, make more and more and more copies so that the assay can detect it. With antigen, you're basically looking at what's there, not changing it at all, and so it's not as sensitive. So what that means is that you may miss some positives.
Okay, quick question. So for the antigen test, if we're talking about a high amount, does a high amount of virus equal worse symptoms?
No. So there's no data to suggest that more virus equals more symptoms, because it's really your immune response to that virus.
Okay, so you could be asymptomatic and both tests could pick it up?
Yes.
Okay, but obviously the PCR is the gold standard.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some basics about the test. If you have a test kit at home, for example, do not store them in your garage in the winter. And you told me a little anecdotal story about people who were having parties over the holidays and storing them in their garage. Tell us about that and why that didn't work out so well.
Yeah, so over the holidays, I really appreciated how people wanted to test themselves before exposing their grandparents or siblings who are too young to be vaccinated. And so the idea is you want to test yourself before you're around everyone. So people were testing outside or in their garages and leaving their kits in the freezing cold. My family's from New York City, and this is what was happening in that area. It was just like Chicago. It's snowing. It's freezing. The test kit says explicitly, do not store under, I don't know if it's 40 degrees or what the exact number is, but it's definitely when you're in the Northeast or the upper Midwest, you're below that temperature. And so you can get false negatives because you're storing it at the wrong conditions. People also had issues where their antigen kits were delivered over the holidays. They sat in the mailbox for 5 days at 10 degrees. And so they were unable to use them.
And does that ruin the test at all? Like once it melts or whatever, does it become usable again?
There's not enough studies to really show how that works. But they do say if it's too hot or too cold, which obviously we'll run into this summer. If you're going to leave your kit outside at 110 degrees in Chicago, you're going to run into issues as well. We just don't have enough data of how long it has to sit out for it to be accurate again.
Gotcha.
Okay, now let's talk about the scenarios where you should test. One would be if you've been exposed and you know about it.
Correct.
Even though you don't have symptoms.
Correct.
If you have symptoms, which can be just a sore throat, right, with this Omicron variant?
Just a sore throat, just a headache, really allergy symptoms.
So your message is, if in doubt, just test, because chances are it's probably COVID.
Yes. And so it's really important, though, because we cannot trust a negative. And that even goes to PCR. If you get tested, let's say I found out that a family member has COVID and I saw them today. I can't get tested today. It's going to be too soon. You're going to get negative. You have to wait days before testing. And so
days after the exposure.
Days after the exposure. So I know it's really hard when you get that call or text from someone saying, hey, I have COVID. I was around you yesterday. You want to go out immediately and get tested? Don't do that. You have to wait.
2 days?
I think it's like 3 to 5. It really depends. And we've seen, especially with Omicron, where the amount tends to be lower in the nose. And so people are testing negative longer.
Okay, but what if you have, I know there's a million scenarios, but this just came to my head. What if you've been exposed and you have symptoms? You still want to wait 3 to 5 days?
Test when you have symptoms, but test again. And so the recommendation is if you have symptoms, you should test. And then if it's negative, it doesn't mean it's not COVID. Test again. And so it's a snapshot in time.
Like in 2 days.
Yep, in 2 days. 1 to 2 days.
Okay, gotcha. So let's talk about the importance of doing these tests correctly, because that's another reason why you might get a false negative. Okay, Paige, how do we do these correctly?
Follow the instructions exactly and don't just assume. I've had a lot of PCR tests done on myself working in healthcare, but it was my first time doing a self-antigen test. And like, I have a PhD, I'm board certified, I can do high complexity testing. And looking at these instructions, I'm like, wow, there's a lot to take in there where you can assume you just swab yourself, you stick in a cartridge, you're done. But really, it's 15 seconds in each nostril making wide, long movements. And then you're supposed to insert into a card going counterclockwise. Clockwise. It's just like that, where it's like, I can't remember all the steps off the top of my head. And I can see if you're trying to get this done, easily missing a step or skipping a step or doing something out of order. And so it's really important to actually have the label and the instructions out in front of you as you're doing it. Because if you do skip a step or you don't do 15 seconds exactly in each nostril, you may not get the accurate result. So it's really important. And 15 seconds doesn't seem like a long time until you're timing yourself. And I could not believe how long 15 seconds was.
Right.
To stop myself, am I done yet? Same thing with waiting for the test results. It's really, you're like, oh, look, it's done. I can read it. But if it says read after 15 minutes, don't read at 6 minutes. You have to wait till 15 minutes. And
Right.
And any kind of line means positive. So don't say that's faint or is that a line? It's like a pregnancy test.
It's exactly like a pregnancy test. And I think that that's also a good point. Like a pregnancy test, if you take it too soon, it's going to be negative. And if you don't read it correctly or follow the instructions, it's going to be negative. And so same thing with a COVID test. Most of the kits have lines you have to read, just like a pregnancy test. Faint is still positive. And it's really hard with the naked eye to judge that. So if unsure, test again.
And it reminds me, too, I was talking about this with somebody else, like when you get a new board game, like at our house when the kids were little and we get those instructions and we'd start reading them. And then I would say, let's just start playing. We'll figure it out.
Right.
Because I didn't want to take the few minutes. But this is one of those instances where read the board game instructions.
Especially if you're stressed out, I could see people just wanting to get it done and then get the results right
Especially
away.
when you're doing it for a gathering and it's turning a swab clockwise. In your mind, you're like, does this really matter? or like 15 seconds, like I advise you, use your phone to time you because you may think like, oh, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, but that's not accurate.
Yeah.
And even those at-home tests, they have different directions. So don't assume like, oh, I did this before. I know what to do. If you have a different brand name, it's going to have different instructions.
Okay. That's good advice.
Thanks.
It's a learning curve, and I think it's hard because people are using these tests as the basis of I shouldn't be around grandma or I should be around grandma. And I think that the scientific community and the public health community have not been great about explaining that these tests are good for kind of ruling in COVID. Like, you're positive, isolate. But explaining if it's too soon or you don't swab your nose really. Like, when I swabbed my nose, I started sneezing. You can attest to that. Like, and it's hard to get a good sample on yourself because you're like, oh, like I won't go too deep or it tickles or, it's really hard as just a person swabbing yourself to really get the best sample. I think it's also tricky because we hear all this information about Omicron being more prevalent in the throat. And so people are getting negatives in the nose, but positives in the throat. And it's like, what do we do? Should we just swab our throats? The quick answer to that is no, follow the instructions exactly. But the reason I bring this up is kids in the UK were actually purposely getting false positives to get out of school because Coca-Cola and those like acidic beverages can give false positives.
Really?
Yes.
Really?
And so there are stories.
Wait.
Molecular, you cannot get false positives because it's RNA, and
But what is happening with the Coke? That's what I'm.
The way it interacts with the chemicals, it just gives a false positive. So something with the acidity level. So people started testing it with coffee, you name it. But that's why also you don't want to necessarily just jump to your throat because we don't know what causes false positives. Nose has been studied so much by the FDA, right? It's something that it's approved for. We know what really goes into your nose, right? But when you're actually swabbing your throat, you drink, you eat.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot more that can interfere. So that's why it may seem like a great idea to swab your throat yourself and maybe pick up Omicron earlier, but we just don't know how it functions well in the throat. So, however, there are PCR tests. Like here at NorthShore, we do offer PCR tests off the throat as well.
Okay. Let the professionals do it.
Yeah, let the professionals do it. I would say I do not think there's any way you can get a good throat sample on yourself without gagging. There is no way.
Well, that's scary, too, because if you're younger, you might ingest that swab or something and have it caught in your throat. I mean, worst case scenario, I'm sure, but
I will take 1 million nasopharyngeal brain-picking swabs over a single throat swab on myself.
Yeah.
Really?
Okay.
Wow. Yeah.
But I would say that's the thing is like we should use these test kits as intended because if not, we could get these false positives or false negatives and we don't know what that means.
I think also that the Omicron variant has been shown to maybe settle or replicate fastest in the throat. And people that I've spoke to that have really bad sore throats that feel like strep throat or something.
Yes.
That's how bad. So remind people that of our anatomy and that it's all connected, that if you have a sore throat, it's going to be in your nose too, correct?
So it does there seems to be a delay in potentially having the protein up in the nose. But yes, it's all connected. And that's why it's also important to wear your mask above your nose. I know this was like shocking to a good chunk of the population, but we have to cover our nose because it's connected to our mouth and we know that's the whole respiratory system.
It's the whole laughing milk through your nose thing where, you're drinking milk and then you laugh and it goes through your nose.
Then maybe don't test yourself immediately after that.
Right.
But I do want to reiterate, molecular tests do not have the issues of the false positives there.
Right. That's good. That's good to know. This might be a silly question, but is there a time of day that's best? Or if you're a smoker or a coffee drinker or, is there a time when you shouldn't be doing those things before taking a test?
That's a great question. If you are ingesting liquid, food, anything, that is more important for a saliva and throat-based test.
Right.
So unless you do the whole milk out your nose thing, it should not impact your nose. But that's a great question. It hasn't really been studied.
What if you smelled a lot of flowers recently? No, I'm just joking.
And you're sneezing everywhere and you get swallowed. You got all the pollen. That's a great question. Luckily, I don't think we'll find that out till probably like June here because it's a frozen tundra until then.
That's true.
I also want to remind people, because we have all this great information, and if I was listening to this myself, I'd be thinking, yeah, that's great, but I can't find a test anywhere. So the federal government also has a website called covidtest.gov, where you can go online and order a free at-home test kit from the federal government. They mail it to you.
We'll put that link in the description.
Yes, covidtest.gov. So that should be a good resource for people. And then other places, Paige, that we can get home antigen tests are?
Local pharmacies are a great start. Walmart, for instance, does carry and does ship those, so I know people have used that. It is really hard to get an antigen test, and I've had a lot of family reach out to me trying to find them, and it just depends on your area of the country.
So call ahead.
Call ahead. And I know it's very tempting just to order off of Amazon, but make sure that the test kits are legitimate. Unfortunately, there are people profiting off the pandemic, whether it's fake KN95s we've seen, fake testing kits. Make sure it's a reputable brand. You can actually check the FDA website to see which at-home tests are approved.
And remember, too, that the government also has allowed insurance companies to reimburse people for these kits. So save your receipts. You may be able to get reimbursed by insurance companies. So, Paige, as we come to a close here, can you summarize your top advice for our listeners?
My top advice would be test, test, test. If you are exposed or you have symptoms, be sure to test. And don't just test once. If you get a negative, you cannot necessarily trust it. It may be too soon. There may not be enough virus. You may have not followed the instructions correctly, and that happens. And a positive, isolate. Let everyone you've been around know that you are positive. And then also follow the test exactly. So that means if it says do not store out in the freezing cold, which they all say that, don't store your test in your garage in the Chicago winter. Be sure to follow exactly what it says for how long to swab yourself, how to swab yourself, how to read the test, how much solution to add. Follow it exactly.
Do we want to talk about the reason for testing? Because, like, I saw someone this morning who said, like, we're all just going to get Omicron, so I don't even, they've lost all heart.
Yeah.
Do you have any light at the end of the tunnel or, any good advice for why we should be testing?
So just because Omicron is very prevalent does not mean we're all going to get it. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that we have a huge immunocompromised patient population. So those under the age of 5 who can't get vaccinated, you have pregnant women, you have those with cancer, cystic fibrosis, you name it. And we still care about them. And we shouldn't just ignore, because the majority of people may be fine who are vaccinated and boosted. We can't ignore that. We do need to protect those who are most vulnerable. And it's also important because of things like long-haul COVID. We don't know really what triggers long-haul COVID. We don't know how you're going to react. There are people who are fully boosted who may get very sick. And being able to prevent the spread, whether it's to your grandma who's higher risk or to even within your household, we need to know who's positive.
And we need to keep fighting, I think.
We need to keep fighting. I think we can't just give up. And I think it's been very disheartening, especially for parents who have kids under the age of 5 or those who live with elderly parents or have immunocompromised situations, because being told everyone's going to get it, that's not the right message we should have. We can still protect. We can still take these precautions. To me, I don't mind wearing a mask in case my face warm in Chicago anyway.
Totally,
so
yeah.
That's how I feel, too.
Exactly.
Yeah, win-win.
And I'll say we've conducted this whole podcast while wearing masks, and you can still hear us just fine.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that, for me, that's a small sacrifice to make to keep people safe around me.
Just thinking about what you do and your team does every day makes my brain hurt. I can't even imagine.
They're honestly so determined. They have persevered. They are incredible, and I am beyond thankful to have them as the team. We would not be able to function as a healthcare system if we didn't have them behind the scenes doing all this testing. And it's not just COVID. We still have cancer diagnostics. We still have other infections, flu, newborn screening, even just looking at complete blood cell counts with core lab. Like all these tests that still go on behind the scenes, just because COVID's happening doesn't stop the rest. And they have persevered. They've given up so much, and they are really, honestly incredible. I am part of a huge team, as I've said, but I do also want to recognize Dr. Linda Sabatini and Dr. Erin McIlvania, who are the directors also of molecular and microbiology, as well as our amazing managers, Chris Sutherland, Rebecca Lindgren, and Mike Boma, who have been instrumental in all the testing. Even just covering each other if anyone's sick, or just having that kind of like person to troubleshoot with. And I think one thing people don't realize that behind the scenes, everyone is dealing with so much, whether their family's sick or we have reagent supply shortages, staffing shortages just because of out with illness or exposure, and everyone's just pushed through, and we've really become a family, and I think that's a silver lining of the pandemic, and whatever gets thrown at us, we find a solution because patient care comes first. And so I just think that I want them to be recognized and understand that this is such a huge team effort, and I'm thankful for them all.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being here and for your team that's doing all this hard work. We really appreciate it. And I think this is going to help a lot of people.
Yeah, thank you very much.
If you do know a lab professional in your life, please be sure to thank them, whether they're microbiology, core, molecular, hematology, you name it. They've been working very hard.
Even if you don't understand what they're talking about.
Exactly. Just be like, I support you. Can I get you coffee, ice cream, something?
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, can I ask you a question? I don't know if you want to use this, but during the height of the pandemic, before vaccinations, and you had all those live viruses coming through the lab, right? What was it like? The fear or I'm just curious.
Or was it
like,
business as usual? Like you guys are always dealing with viruses and stuff?
So were you in hazmat suits?
We're in non-hazmat suits. But I will say we always do work with infectious diseases, whether it's HIV or herpes, gonorrhea. So we know how to handle infectious substances. But I will say that one thing that was particularly difficult was a lot of people had to make sacrifices, not going home for Christmas, not going home for the holidays, not seeing elderly relatives because they did not want to expose them. Even though we have very great precautions, obviously working with COVID, you're still around people all day. None of us can work from home. And so to see the sacrifices the team made to be able to keep their family safe, taking up extra shifts, I think it was incredibly busy, but everyone pulled together. And I think that the minute the vaccines came out, it was a huge, huge relief for all of us. But I think just how busy everything was, it's really incredible how much people gave up for this. And I don't think that's ever recognized.
So when you would go home at the end of the day to your family and your husband, did you have to like leave things in the garage and then go shower, or am I being like...
No, I honestly did not see my parents for about a year. So my parents live in the New York City area. We did not go home for Christmas. We did not go home for Thanksgiving. We did Zoom everything. It just wasn't worth the risk. At that time, again, when you work in a hospital, you're around everyone, even though they're wearing masks, you're still around everyone. And we just didn't know then. And so we gave up a lot of holidays, a lot of time with family.
But you're going back into your own home. Yeah.
I always, and I still do this in general, I work with infectious diseases. I shower as soon as I get home. My clothes go straight into the washer. And so I do take those precautions, but that's who I am as well.
So my sister used to do that too. She's a nurse, and she's not in infectious diseases, but she left her shoes outside in the garage, then would come into the house, put them in the washer, and go shower. Same thing.
Yeah, you see, this is before the pandemic. I never wear shoes in my house. Like, as an infectious disease person, my outdoor clothes go right in the laundry.
Oh, tell us why. What could be on our shoes page?
So that's exactly. So for me, that hasn't changed. But I'm also, I don't work directly with the patients as well. So risk is much lower than someone who does work with the patients. And I think those physicians and nurses, respiratory therapists, physical therapists, everyone who's involved, I can't imagine everything they had to go through and still go through with the choices they've had to make for their families.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks to everybody here. The new federal website to get a free at-home antigen test, covidtest.gov. NorthShore.gov.
The link to find FDA-approved testing kits will also be in the description of this podcast episode.
If you have any topics that you'd like us to discuss, email us at publicrelations@northshore.org, and we'll be happy to get to those topics for you.
You can also follow us on social media at North Shore Web on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook.
Stay safe, wear a mask,
And thanks.
and see you next time.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. See you
Thanks
next
for
time.
listening.
Thanks, Paige.
Thanks, Paige. That was
I
great.
sound like 12, but it's okay.
No, you sound perfect.
It helps because now, like, I'm like.